What's up, YouTube? So in this video, we're going to go over some issues I've found in our Next.js Template repository that has over 3,000 GitHub stars and 750 forks. If you're one of the people using this repository, I very highly recommend you watch this video. And even if you haven't used this repository, it's going to give you a lot of good insights about some of the mistakes that people make that don't fully understand the magic of Next.js and React. If you think this might be you, or if you think you know someone, don't forget to share this video or hit the subscribe button. But let's get into it. As I said, I kind of just want to go over why you need to be careful when you pick up these template repositories. And that's not to say that they're bad examples or that they're a bad starting place, because they're not. They're a very good example. But we still need to be aware that there's a few common misconceptions, especially with Next.js and how it handles different interactions between the client and the server, as well as authentication. So one of the biggest concerns I found with this application is that there's kind of no authentication consistency. So this page, for example, which is just the dashboard page, there is a check for a session user ID to redirect if it doesn't exist. But on the API routes, there is no validation for that same session. So what I mean by that is we look at this route. This is an upload image route. It takes a file, it uploads it to Cloudflare, I'm presuming. Yep, Cloudflare. But there's no validation of who that user is or how that data is then returned. So we know here it's returning the URL for the image, but that's only implemented in the client. So when this route is inevitably called, so if we go upload image, if we do a global search actually, so we can see here it's sending this form data, but the form data takes like a profile image. If we do a global search here, we can find all instances of it, and we see it's not really doing anything else other than taking that image. So it sends an image, but it doesn't know who that image is for. So when we take the image and we save it, we just return the URL, which then sets the URL in the state and then does nothing else with it. So the moment the user refreshes, then they've lost the URL and they've lost the image, and then they'll think that it's failed, so they'll upload another one. And I mean, that's just generally not a good idea. You would want to take the URL before it's returned, and you would want to do something with that URL. And to do that, you would need to know who the user is that's authenticated to upload the image. So what should be in here is some kind of auth flow. So like check user or get user, format some kind of table, and then with the user ID in the file. Yep. And then after you've got the file, you would save it. Save the file to be fetchable from this user. So there's so many things missing here that this API route in itself is a potential security issue. All I need is this route, which is publicly shown on this page. So anyone that is using this template repository that's calling an API request from the client has exposed that the only thing I need to do is make a post request with the form data to this route, and it will submit a file. Now, if I was a bad actor, all I would do is take a file that's, well, I would probably not start with 10 megabytes because I don't know that it's 10 megabytes. I would start with 20 or 30 megabytes and see how big of a file I can push up. I would eventually figure out that it's 10 megabytes, and I would just sit there with an infinite loop sending 10 megabyte files to this API route, because it's going to keep saving them, and this is going to increase the cost of that person's bill with Cloudflare. Now, yeah, storage isn't expensive, but if you sit there and spam 100,000 requests at 10 megabytes, it's still gonna add up. If you run this for a while, it's gonna add up. So there's a few problems here. First of all, no authentication. Second of all, they haven't given it some kind of data structure to reference that user and the file, and they're not doing anything with the returned result. All they're doing is just returning the URL. They're not actually saving it to a database table to reference later. So this one API route has three problems. We can solve that a little bit later, and I will probably put up a pull request for this exact thing, because again, I don't want people to make this same mistake and then extend on it and make the same mistake in every API route. But we also need to go back to the original problem of exposing the API to the client. So there's two issues here. The first issue is that you never want to call API routes from the client. Now, there's an argument for and against this. The argument for this is that server actions are under the hood API routes. Yes, that's technically true, but they are a rotating namespace for an API route. While calling an API from a server action is generally generally more bandwidth in terms of request count. It's much safer. And that rotating ID on the server action means that it's not infinitely like spammable, right? So you can reverse engineer server actions, but because they rotate on deployments, they change. So the previous versions are cleared, and that person that's potentially breaching your server action would have to then reverse engineer the new URL. It's not to say it's impossible. It's just a complication that we like to include in production software. And before this was a thing, we would use what's called API proxies. So our server API is never actually exposed ever to a user. It's always some kind of proxy, or in this case, a server action that's exposed. This just allows us to secure the API at another level where we can't be reverse engineered on a direct level. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I pull up, for example, Postman, now I got AI built in, of course, fuck that off. So say I've got API/upload image. Now, if this is a normal website, all I would need to do is go, I'm not hosting this, so I would just go HTTP, totally random site .com/API/upload image. That's all I would need, plus my image, and then I would probably pass it as a post request, since here it says it's a post request. So I would just pass in here. I would go headers, I would pass in, I'd make it a post, and then I would pass in an image here. It could be form data, it could be raw, it could be anything. And that gives me basically access to this route, so I could reverse engineer the rest of the API now. So I know that /API is how they define their API route. So all I need to do is go in here and be like, what other routes could there be? What about users? Is users going to return something? Is it going to return a get? Like, again, I don't have this running to show you, but if I could, in a later video, if you want to see it in action, I'm happy to set this up and show you that it actually works. But another one that exists is chat. So I know that there's an AI agent running on /API/chat because it's defined in the repo. So I could very easily just go in here and be like, okay, subscription, chat, route. So this one, again, this doesn't have security. So you're basically just giving someone free access to their API key in terms of like doing web searches and stuff like that. Now, that's not to say that this is, again, like a bad thing. If you've got other levels of security there, a public accessible API can be okay at times. I personally have been taught to obfuscate it away and make it harder for someone to find. Now, another thing we need to talk about in this same route, we go back to upload image, is again authentication. There is no verification in here that there is actually a user. Right now here, I don't even need a user to upload a file. I can do this completely anonymously. I could even use server functions to do this and rotate IPs. So even if there was some kind of proxy in front of this service, it would still be a way of spamming their server. So another thing we need to talk about is authentication at the API layer. And it seems like they've tried to do that with what we see in the middleware here. We can see that there's early returns for webhooks. This is a great example of what you should use middleware for. It doesn't need to run for every request, so we return early if there's a situation where it can. Things like if there's a session and they're on sign in or sign up, redirect to the dashboard. Again, great implementations for middleware. These are early things that we can do before the service is hit with a request to get /dashboard. Where it gets a little bit trickier is, okay, if there's no session and the path name starts with /dashboard, then what happens? Now, this is fine, but it's not very extendable. What happens when we have, for example, like /user profile, just /profile? What happens if we have just /profile? What happens if we have /edit profile? Like, these are all just examples, but now we're getting into a point where it's not maintainable. And yeah, you could come in here and be like, okay, adjust this to use an array for the routes, and the AI is going to update that, and you're going to use an array-based setting for that. And yep, sure, we keep that, and then this is all of a sudden cleaner. But now your app scales to hundreds of pages, thousands of pages, and you just keep extending this, and you end up with a shit ton of files here or shit ton of code here in middleware, and it becomes really hard to maintain. Like, that doesn't really make sense. Who's going to know exactly that they need to look here for this exact thing? Now, middleware, again, it's great if it's doing doing something that's universally beneficial to lowering the request count on your server. What it's not good at is this. And that's why I personally would not even have done it this way. Things like having an early return to sign up, great. Again, perfect. But what I would probably do is here I would have a redirect, which they do. So this is the first implementation where it makes sense for them to have solved this issue. Now, that's not to say that this is best practice, because this is going to make a server request rather than an edge request to do this thing. So for this particular thing, if performance matters, if you want them to hit an edge location before they hit your server, then this might make sense. But you need to think about how you are defining this, because you would not define this as protected routes. You would define this as protected pages. You don't want to define protected routes, because that's the other thing you're not thinking about here, is this just covers the page requests. What about all of your API requests? That's you've completely forgotten that there's two parts to this application, pages and API routes. So if you were then to extend this for every API route, then you'd go protected API routes, and you'd have /dashboard /API /up. And again, you're all of a sudden you're at a point where you have all of this code that it's like, well, if no session, then return a cookie. Yep, that's fine. But now you're maintaining an entire list of API routes. Is that where you want to do it? I have applications that have hundreds of different API routes. Now, do I want to maintain different permission levels? Probably not. That's just really not efficient. So what you're better off doing is handling it per route, because again, like, it is slightly more code in terms of what you see on a page or on a file, but it gives a better structure, and you can know, looking at that feature, what that feature's permission level is. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to come back once I've updated some of this code, and we're going to discuss why these principles I follow are just better. By the way, we're not going to do this manually. We're going to have AI help us do it. All right. So I'm just going to kind of go over the prompt I've given it, just to be clear. Like, I have a template that I've worked on for multiple years. It's a totally different structure, but it does use Next.js and Betterauth. So a lot of it does apply here. And if you would prefer to use that template, I will link it in the description. We want to help this guy. We want to help the 3,000 stars on this GitHub repository to make sure they're not producing any of these issues in their application. So we're going to help them out. We're going to fix all this stuff up, and we're going to submit it as a PR. I've just put that this repo has multiple security flaws and issues. The API is publicly accessible, and there are client components calling API routes directly with no auth checks pre-request. Here is my implementation from another template project. Please refactor this to use these patterns. I pasted in the patterns that I use for the authentication. The API routes use the following functionality. Again, I've copied in some functionality from another project. Also use server actions to invoke form submissions from the client, and anywhere there is data being fetched from the client, we need to refactor to fetch the data from async pages. So I'm just going to do one final check, make sure I have everything I need here, and then we will put it in plan mode and see what it comes up with. So let's have a look at the plan. And again, more time in planning means it's going to do a better job. So we will definitely want to read through this. So I like that it's picked up on the pages that are not server pages. It's pretty much doing everything else I like. I get rid of the middleware part completely. So we'll just let it run it, and we can do that manually after. All right, so that's finished running. So now all we're going to do is we're just going to come back, and we're going to take a look at what it's changed. We don't need this. If we go here, we can take a look at this route handler function. So first thing to do is to look at the session handling. This all looks good. And as you can see now, we have this here defined as is public true. Is authenticated true. But if we wanted to, we could change this to is public. If we wanted this to be a public API route, which I don't understand if that's what they want or not, having an AI provider might be something they want to keep public. But if that's the case, they might want to rate limit this. So what I would put here is like a comment, like if this is public, you might want to add a rate limiter. I think limiter is spelled wrong. I don't care. So similarly here on the image page, yeah, we want to do the same thing. We want to take the user. We want to make sure they're authenticated. We then want to go through. It still hasn't. Not sure why it hasn't done that. So the first thing we're going to do is go upload image in upload API route. So all I'm doing is I'm just telling it, hey, we need to finish upload image to include a way of storing the data for the image and the user. And then in the middleware, we can come back here. To be honest, we are just going to delete all of these. And actually what we're going to do, we're going to go back to what was here first. completely, and we can change this. So now we have middleware handling if that's on a page request. So that's great. We're not going to make a server request for dashboard. If there's a user, it's going to get hit at the edge, and we don't need to worry about API protection. API route protection is handled in each route. And on the dashboard, we have this. Again, we could move this even to like a layout file as the project grows. All right, so it does look like it's done some stuff here. We take the image, we take the URL, and we get the user ID here. So that's good. I'm happy with that. This ties this to a user. We would then, in the future, if we wanted to do, say, an update route, then we could use this same thing, but do an update here rather than an insert. This looks fine. That's the one we went over before. The upload page is now a server page, I believe. It's not, but it does use an action. Great. We're not calling that from the client. And now the action is calling it, and it's using our secure fetch function to do that. If there's no session, it will not hit the request because we are calling secure fetch. We are hitting a secure API route. We have an action here, use server. I don't know why you don't need use server and server only. Actually, that's not even going to work. This one can be server only, but the image action cannot be server only because that's called from a client page. Again, I wouldn't have it like this. I would have the page as the server component, and I would have the form as the client component. That's not something I'm really interested in fixing right now. Everything else looks okay. I'm not too disappointed in the result here. The biggest thing is like what it's done on this functionality with the authentication wrapper. So this is, for some people, this can be confusing to understand. We've got 3 different handlers for single function. We've got all these different types and requests and stuff like that. Now, if that's something that you're not sure about, I can go into that more in depth in the future, but all you need to know is we have one here that's for setting public. We have one for authenticated, and that allows us to choose which one we want to use. In this format here, we have route options, which uses is public or is authenticated. This just means we don't need both. If we come in here, we can see we have is authenticated and it works. It doesn't depend on the other one being defined. And similarly, if we go is public, it will have the same result. Is public will fail because we don't have a user ID. So that's obviously why we do this. Gives us some nice IntelliSense. And yeah, so in summary, all we've done is really implemented a few best practices that Next.js actually recommends. And if you are not sure, you can refer to their documentation. They talk about how server actions were intended for submitting forms, and then they go into further detail about how server actions used for form data should be used to contact your API. There is nothing about why server actions are being used for making direct to database requests. A lot of that just is things that the community has somehow thought was their intention with that, but it's actually not. You can find that in the documentation if you look for it. So again, like the biggest thing is like without these best practices, you're exposing a few things. You're exposing your API publicly with no authentication. You're making it more complicated in the future to then come in and have to maintain things like middleware and authentication for every API route or page route. And then the other thing is like API abstraction. You don't want to expose your API publicly. This is a situation that comes in incredibly useful on large applications where you have things like a desktop application, a mobile application, a website. If you want to have all of those 3 things hitting your API or the same API, then bandwidth is important. And if one of those exposes those API routes to the public, then that's just more load on your server, which means more implications for your users. So I do wish more people understood this. There's a lot more magic that happens with Next.js that people just don't have an understanding of. And some of these issues are things that have allowed me to go and reverse engineer company APIs and collect hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of personal user information and email addresses. And if you pair this with super base RLS that's been very poorly set up, you actually come up with a situation where through reverse engineering an API, I've been able to access entire databases for companies. And generally, I never do anything with that data. I always tell them, hey, you need to fix this. There's an opportunity for me to make some money to help them fix that thing. But generally, I tell them out of just the goodness of my heart and the fact I want the internet to be safe for everyone. So again, if you found this useful, I would love if you subscribed or hit the like button because it helps. I am trying to grow this channel. If there's anything you guys found that you think I might be wrong about or you think I could do better, I would love to get your feedback, but thanks for watching.